The year is 1070 BC. The workers building the pharaoh's tomb in the Valley of the Kings have not been paid in 2 months. For the first time in 2,000 years of Egyptian civilization, the workers go on strike. They walk off the job, march to the temple, and demand their grain wages. This is not a minor labor dispute. This is the first recorded workers' strike in human history. And it's a symptom of something catastrophic. The richest, most powerful, longest-lasting civilization on Earth is going broke. Egypt had ruled for 2,000 years by this point. The pyramids were already ancient. The empire stretched from Nubia to Syria. The Nile fed millions. Egyptian gold filled the treasuries of the known world. And yet, the government could not pay the men building a tomb. How does a civilization that lasted 3,000 years, longer than every other empire in history combined, still collapse? The answer is the same way they all do. The same 5-stage pattern that destroyed the British Empire, that destroyed Rome, that is happening in America right now. Egypt survived invasions, plagues, civil wars, and famines for 3 millennia. But it could not survive this pattern. And the pattern doesn't care how long you lasted. It doesn't care how many pyramids you built. It doesn't care that you invented writing, mathematics, and medicine. The pattern is mathematical. And when the math stops working, 3,000 years of greatness means nothing. Let me show you the 5 stages. Amenhotep III sits in his palace at Malkata in 1380 BC, the richest man in the world. His architects have just presented plans for a new temple complex at Luxor. It will take 30 years to build, employ 10,000 workers, consume enough grain to feed a city. The pharaoh approves it without hesitation. Why wouldn't he? The treasury is overflowing. The granaries are full. Egypt has so much surplus that the pharaoh is literally giving gold away to foreign kings as gifts just to demonstrate how wealthy he is. This is Egypt at its absolute peak. And this is the trap. Every year, like clockwork, the Nile floods. The river rises, spreads across the valley, and deposits rich black soil across the farmland. While every other ancient civilization struggles to feed itself, Egypt produces so much surplus grain that it becomes the currency of the ancient world. Egyptian grain feeds the Mediterranean. Egyptian gold decorates foreign palaces. Egyptian papyrus carries the knowledge of the known world. The Nile is Egypt's reserve currency, not a metaphor, functionally identical. Just as the dollar's dominance lets America borrow endlessly, the Nile's guaranteed agricultural surplus let Egypt spend without consequences for centuries. This is stage 1, the resource advantage that becomes a trap. Egypt's wealth was built on one advantage, the Nile's predictable flooding cycle. This created massive grain surpluses that turned Egypt into the breadbasket of the ancient world. Grain was literally used as currency. Workers paid in grain. Foreign trade conducted in grain, taxes collected in grain. The pharaohs built a massive state apparatus funded by this surplus. Temples that took 200 years to build, armies that conquered from Sudan to Syria, bureaucracies that employed thousands of scribes just to count the harvest. For over 1,000 years, the surplus seemed infinite. Spend more, the Nile will provide. But dependency on a single advantage is a vulnerability disguised as strength, and Egypt never diversified. Why innovate when the river does the work for you? Why build new industries when grain pays for everything? Why develop trade networks when you already have what everyone wants? Amenhotep III built the Temple of Luxor, the Colossi of Memnon, palaces that housed thousands. He didn't conquer new territory. He didn't need to. The Nile provided everything. The grain surplus was so enormous that Egypt exported wealth while importing luxury. Gold from Nubia flowed north. Cedar from Lebanon flowed south. The economy seemed infinite because the resource seemed infinite. This is America's exact position after World War II. The dollar became the reserve currency at Bretton Woods in 1944. Every country needed dollars for trade. Every central bank held dollars for reserves. This created the same illusion Egypt had. Unlimited resources. No consequences for overspending. America built a massive state apparatus on top of that advantage. Egypt assumed the Nile would always flood. America assumes the world will always need dollars. And when Egypt's advantage weakened, when climate shifts made the Nile irregular, when droughts came, the entire system had nothing to fall back on. Rameses II stands at Kadesh in 1274 BC, facing the largest chariot army ever assembled. The Hittite Empire has ambushed his forces in what is now Syria. Egypt commits everything. 20,000 soldiers, 2,000 chariots. The battle lasts all day, neither side wins, both sides claim victory. Rameses returns to Egypt and covers his temples with images of his great triumph. But the real cost isn't the battle, it's what happens after. Egypt now has to maintain a permanent military presence across an empire stretching from Nubia in the south to Syria in the north. Garrisons in Canaan, forts along the Libyan border, naval patrols in the Mediterranean, each one individually justified. Egypt must defend its trade routes. Egypt must protect its vassals. Egypt must show strength. or enemies will test boundaries. Each garrison bleeds the treasury dry. This is stage 2. The military outgrows the economy. The New Kingdom, 1550 to 1070 BC, was Egypt's imperial phase. Thutmose III conquered an empire that required permanent occupation. His successor spent the next 500 years trying to hold it. Rameses. The second fought the Hittites to a stalemate at Kadesh, massive resource drain for no territorial gain. Rameses III fought off the Sea Peoples around 1178 BC. This was an existential threat. Mysterious invaders from the north, possibly displaced by Bronze Age collapse, attacked Egypt by land and sea. Rameses won. Egypt survived. But the cost was catastrophic. The military campaigns required paying mercenaries, Libyans, Nubians, Shorten Sea pirates from the Mediterranean. Egypt increasingly depended on foreign soldiers because its own population couldn't sustain endless wars. The grain that should have fed Egyptian workers was going to foreign mercenaries and distant garrisons. This is what caused the workers' strike from the beginning. The year is 1170 BC, during the reign of Rameses III. The workers at Deir el-Medina, the village where tomb builders lived, hadn't been paid in 2 months. The treasury was empty, not because Egypt was poor. Egypt still had grain, Egypt still had gold, but the resources were committed elsewhere, to soldiers in Syria, to mercenaries guarding the Libyan frontier, to the ships patrolling against the Sea Peoples. The workers marched to the Temple of Medinet Habu and refused to leave until they were paid. It worked. They got their grain. But the precedent was set. For the first time, the people building Egypt's monuments had to fight the government for their wages. The social contract was breaking. Egypt maintained garrisons across an empire it could no longer afford. America maintained 750 military bases in more than 80 countries. Egypt hired foreign mercenaries because its own population couldn't sustain endless wars. America's military spending exceeds the next 9 countries combined, funded entirely by debt. Egypt fought the Hittites to a stalemate at Kadesh, enormous cost for no territorial gain. America's interest payments are approaching $1 trillion per year. That's more than the defense budget. The military has consumed the economy. And the workers who built Egypt? They went on strike because their wages were spent on wars they'd never see, in lands they'd never visit, for reasons they didn't understand. Sound familiar? By 1100 BC, the Temple of Amun at Karnak owns 1/3 of all farmland in Egypt. Read that again. A single temple complex, not the pharaoh, not the government, not the people, controls 33% of all arable land in the most agriculturally rich nation on earth. The high priest of Amun has become more powerful than the pharaoh. He controls more wealth, commands more loyalty, and pays no taxes on any of it. This is stage 3. The priestly class replaces the productive class. Egyptian temples were not just religious sites. They were massive economic entities. The Temple of Amun at Karnak, by the late New Kingdom, controlled 1/3 of all Egyptian farmland, employed over 80,000 workers and servants, and owned 83 ships. A temple owned a navy. Let that sink in. The priests produced nothing. They didn't grow the grain. They didn't raise the cattle. They didn't build the ships. They managed wealth, performed rituals, and accumulated land. And the temples paid no taxes. It was all for the gods. Meanwhile, the pharaoh's government was going broke because the productive economy was being captured by a non-productive elite class. Egyptian farmers who once worked land they owned or rented from the pharaoh now worked temple land. They became tenants on their own soil. The wealth didn't disappear. It concentrated. The nation got poorer while the temples got richer. Here's how it happened. Pharaohs donated land to temples as offerings to the gods. This was piety, but it was also politics. The priests had enormous influence. Keeping them happy kept the kingdom stable, but once land was donated to a temple, it never came back. Temples didn't pay taxes. Temples didn't sell land. The holdings only grew. By the reign of Rameses III, the Great Harris Papyrus records that Egyptian temples collectively owned 15% of the entire population as servants and workers, and controlled 30% of all cultivated land. This wasn't a religious institution. This was a corporate conglomerate operating. Tax-free. The farmers still farmed. The builders still built. But the wealth flowed upward to a class that produced nothing. Egypt didn't stop working. Egypt stopped benefiting from its own work. Egypt's temples owned 1/3 of the farmland, employed 80,000 people, and paid 0 taxes. Today, America's 10 largest financial institutions control more wealth than the bottom 50% of the population combined, and their effective tax rate is lower than a school teacher's. Same pattern, different temple. America hasn't stopped working either. Americans work more hours than almost any developed nation. But ask yourself, where does the wealth go? In 1069 BC, Egypt splits in 2. The pharaoh rules from the north in Tanis. The high priest of Amun rules from the south in Thebes. For the first time in 2,000 years, there is no unified Egypt, and the neighbors notice. This is stage 4. The empire fragments and foreigners move in. The third intermediate period, 1070 to 664 BC, was chaos. Egypt fractured into competing kingdoms. The north and south became rival states. Within each region, local governors and strongmen seized power. At one point, Egypt had 4 competing pharaohs simultaneously. The Libyan mercenaries, the same soldiers Egypt had been hiring to fight its wars, realized something. The country paying them was weaker than the army they commanded. In 945 BC, a Libyan general named Shoshenq simply took the throne. No invasion needed. He was already inside. He'd been paid by Egypt, trained by Egypt, given land by Egypt, and then he took over. The 22nd dynasty was Libyan. The 23rd dynasty was Libyan. Foreign soldiers ruled Egypt not because they conquered it from outside, but because Egypt invited them in and then couldn't control them. Then the Nubians arrived. The kingdom of Kush, south of Egypt in what is now Sudan, had once been Egypt's colony. Now Kush was stronger than Egypt. Nubian kings marched north and conquered Egypt, establishing the 25th dynasty. They claimed to be restoring Egypt's glory, returning the kingdom to proper rule. But they were foreigners ruling a land that had once ruled them. And then came the Assyrians. In 671 BC, the Assyrian Empire invaded Egypt. They marched down from Mesopotamia with iron weapons and siege engines. Egypt's Bronze Age military couldn't stop them. In 663 BC, the Assyrians sacked Thebes. Thebes, the holiest city in Egypt, the city of Amun, the religious capital for over 1,000 years. The Assyrians looted the temples, burned the palaces, and left. Egypt still had the Nile. The farmland still existed. The grain still grew. But Egypt no longer controlled its own destiny. The wealth was there, but foreigners were taking it. Egypt hired foreign soldiers to defend the empire. Those soldiers eventually just took over. America built an economy dependent on Chinese manufacturing and foreign-held treasury debt. That dependency gives foreign powers leverage over American sovereignty. Egypt watched its neighbors build strength while it fractured internally. Right now, Saudi Arabia is accepting yuan for oil. BRICS nations are building alternative payment systems. Central banks are buying gold at record rates instead of dollars. The world is building alternatives because they watched what happened when Russia's reserves were frozen. They saw the weapon, and they're building defenses. The Assyrian sack of Thebes was Egypt's Suez moment. The day the world saw that 3,000 years of power meant nothing against a stronger force. In 525 BC, the Persian king Cambyses II marches into Egypt. The Battle of Pelusium lasts one day. Egypt, the civilization that built the pyramids that ruled for 3,000 years, that was the richest and most advanced nation on earth for most of human history, falls to a foreign army in a single afternoon. But Egypt wasn't conquered because Persia was strong. Egypt was conquered because Egypt was already empty. The wealth was gone. The military was foreign. The government was fractured. The productive class had been hollowed out. Persia didn't destroy Egypt. The 5 stages did. Persia just walked through the door. This is stage 5, the reckoning. After Persia came the Greeks. Alexander conquered Egypt in 332 BC without a fight. After Alexander came Rome. Augustus made Egypt a personal province in 30 BC after Cleopatra's suicide. Egypt never ruled itself again. The pyramids still stood. The Nile still flooded. But Egypt was no longer Egypt. It was a province, a territory, a possession. The civilization that lasted longer than any other became a province of someone else's empire. The pattern completed. Resource trap, military overextension, non-productive elite capture, fragmentation, foreign reckoning. Egypt lasted 3,000 years. Rome lasted 500. The British Empire lasted 200. Each one followed the same 5 stages. Each one believed it was different. Each one was wrong. America has existed for 250 years, and we're in stage 4. Stage 1, the Nile. Made Egypt rich without effort. America's dollar does the same. Stage 2, Egypt's military consumed the treasury. America spends more on debt interest than defense. Stage 3, Egypt's temples captured the wealth. America's financial sector captures 30% of profits. Stage 4, Egypt fragmented and foreigners moved in. The world is building alternatives to the dollar right now. Stage 5, Egypt fell to Persia in a single day. Britain's empire collapsed in 11 days after Suez. The pattern doesn't care how long you lasted. 3,000 years of power means nothing when the math stops working. The workers who went on strike in 1170 BC, demanding payment for building a tomb, they saw it. They understood that something fundamental had broken. The system that had worked for 2,000 years wasn't working anymore. But by the time the workers saw it, it was already too late. The stages were too far along. Within 150 years, Egypt was ruled by foreigners. Within 600 years, It was a Persian province. Pattern says what comes next. You just have to know where to look.